Barbara Minto, and I'm here to present to you a course on logic in writing. When I say logic in writing, I'm not referring to how to write better sentences and paragraphs, which is what you might expect a writing course to cover. Instead, I concentrate on the analytical process you should use to organize your thinking before you begin to write. Now, I'm making the assumption here that most of the time when you write, you're doing so because you need to tell someone else what you think. Now, it's not very difficult to tell someone else what you think if you just give them the ideas in the order that you think them. For example, here's a typical message. John Collins telephoned to say he can't make the meeting at 9 o'clock. Hal Johnson says he doesn't mind making it later or even tomorrow, but not before 10:30. And Don Clifford's secretary says that Clifford won't return from Frankfurt until tomorrow late. The conference room is booked tomorrow, but free Thursday. Thursday at 11 looks to be a good time. Is that okay with you? I repeat, it's not difficult for you to write, but it's very difficult for your reader to follow. You have to plow through all those irrelevancies to get to the point. What was the point? Could we reschedule today's meeting to Thursday at 11? This would be more convenient for Collins and Johnson and would permit Clifford to be present. It is also the only other time this week that the conference room is free. The difference between the first example and the second lies in their structure. In other words, the first message has a loose structure. It says, here's some information about the people, here's some information about the room, here's the point. The second message reflects what I call the Minto pyramid principle, in that it has a clear pyramid structure. Pyramid refers to the shape of the structure that ideas should take in a piece of writing if they are to be instantly clear to a reader or listener. Principle refers to the rules for putting that structure together. Essentially, the Minto pyramid principle says that you should begin by making your major point and then arrange your minor points so that they support it with a logical argument. Now, most people understand this technique in writing a paragraph. The trick is to use it to organize your thinking in writing an entire document, particularly when it is a long one that attempts to communicate a complex argument. Because let's look at what ordinarily happens when you write. Let's say you have this amount of time, and the first thing you do is sit down and think. Always a good way to begin. And then you write, and then you rewrite, and then you rewrite, and then you rewrite, and then you edit. Now, what you really want to have happen is that you spend far less time and get a much clearer document. The only way that will happen is if you think, and then you write, and then you edit. In other words, you must transfer the thinking that goes on here, because there is real thinking going on here, to here. And that means you need a disciplined approach, which is precisely what this course is meant to give you. The course materials consist of 6 tapes, a workbook, and a textbook. The course itself is organized in 3 parts. Part 1, Tape 1, explains why the structure of clear writing will always be a pyramid, regardless of subject or length or complexity of message, regardless of whether you're writing a memo, sending an email, or preparing a report, and whether you're making a presentation or leaving a voicemail message. Part 2, tapes 2 and 3, show how the ideas in the pyramid fit together vertically to draw the reader with some eagerness through the piece of writing, and horizontally to reveal sound reasoning. Finally, Part 3 shows you how to put all these concepts together and use them to pull the thinking out of your head and build a pyramid of your own that will enable you to write a totally clear document in record time. It explains first in Tape 4 how the introduction is structured to link to the pyramid, then in Tape 5 the actual process for building a pyramid, and finally in Tape 6 how to choose the appropriate form for your major line of reasoning. During each tape, I will at various times give you the opportunity to stop and do an exercise or two in the workbook to cement the concept and strengthen your pyramid building skills. You may also want to read parts of the textbook to get more detail on the concepts. At the end of the workbook, there will be a final exercise that will allow you to apply the Minto pyramid principle as a total process. Here are the timings for each of the tapes and the related exercises. Now, you may be tempted to watch the tapes all the way through and not do the exercises. Let me suggest that you really will get more out of the course if you do the exercises at the appropriate times. What in fact will you get out of the course? First, you will know how to produce a good first draft in a shorter time, even if what you're writing about is technically complex. But equally valuable, you will have a yardstick for judging the clarity and logic of what you or anybody else has written. And if the document is not clear, you will know how to direct someone else to rewrite it. Having said that, we're now ready to begin the course. I want first to talk about why the structure must always be a pyramid. The thing is, when you sit down to write a long document, you face a rather daunting situation. You're being asked to write because you're an expert on the subject about which you're writing, in the sense that you know everything there is to know about the subject. But the person to whom you're writing doesn't want to know everything there is to know. He only wants to know what he needs to know. So you've got a sorting job on your hands. And if it's a very long document, you've got a very large sorting job. Now, this sorting job can be made relatively simple if you can define in advance absolutely what you want the end product to look like. And then all you have to do is work out the steps to get there. Now, what you want the end product to look like is always going to be a pyramid, of course. I said earlier that the pyramid refers to the shape of the structure the ideas should take. The notion that the ideas should have a structure is very important here. What exactly is a structure? Well, what you have here is a pile of bricks. And what you have here is a brick wall. Now, the brick wall is a structure, given that a structure is a set of elements plus rules for putting them together. Now, what's the value of putting things together to form a structure? There is only one value, and that is that with a structure, you can tell if you left something out. And that can be extremely useful when you're writing. Now, this may not seem like much of an insight, but anything that has a function must have a structure so that you can be certain it will perform its function. A piece of writing is no different from anything else in the sense that you bring together a set of elements, that is, your ideas, and they must be arranged according to some rules. In other words, you wouldn't just take your ideas and throw them together like the pile of bricks, would you? You'd want to put them together according to some rules. The question then becomes, what should the rules be? It seems to me the rules have to come from the way people's minds work. And here, there are two concepts I have to explain. How a pyramid forms naturally as you work out your thinking, and how it should be presented. In other words, you usually think from the bottom up, but you always present from the top down. Let me explain the bottom-up concept, sometimes known as grouping and summarizing. Now, when people read, they have constraints about how they can take in information. One of these constraints is what I call the magic number 7. The magic number 7 comes from a treatise by a man named George Miller, who wrote this lovely paper called The Magical Number 7 Plus or Minus 2. And what Miller says is that people's minds are so constrained that they can take in and hold only about 7 things at any one time without memorizing them. Well, some people can take and hold as many as 9. Beethoven was clearly a 9. Some people can only hold 5. I'm a 5 myself. A common number is 3. But the easiest number in the whole world to hold in your head is 1. Now, when the reader sits down to read, he can take in the ideas only one at a time. And this means that by the time he gets past 7 sentences, he ought not to be able to remember what he just read. But he does remember. And this means then that something else must be going on in his head. And apparently, the something else is that he's grouping the ideas together logically and then remembering the layers of the grouping, rather than remembering the individual ideas themselves. To illustrate how that works, suppose you're a man sitting comfortably in your living room at home, and you realize that you forgot to buy your favorite magazine. So you say to your lady wife, "Darling, I'm going out to get a magazine. Is there anything you want me to get while I'm out?" And she says, "Oh, I have such a taste for grapes. Could you get some grapes? But let me look in the refrigerator. I know we need milk." So you go to the cupboard to get your coat. You open the cupboard door, and she says, "Potatoes." You take out your coat, and she says, "Apples." You put one arm in your coat, and she says, "Eggs." You put the other arm in, and she says, "Carrots." You walk across the living room floor, and she says, "Butter." You open the door to go outside, and she says, "Oranges." And as you go outside, you hear her call, "Sour cream." Now, she's given you 9 items. You go out, you get into your car, you drive to the supermarket, you walk in, and what do you buy? Let me pause a minute to see how many you can name. It's difficult, isn't it? Let me read the list again, and as I do, put each item in a category in your mind. I bet you'll remember them all. Grapes, milk, potatoes, eggs, oranges, butter, apples, carrots, and sour cream. Now, how many sections of the supermarket would you go to? 3, isn't it? Dairy products, fruits, and vegetables. And the dairy products are milk, eggs, butter, and sour cream. The fruits are grapes, oranges, and apples. And the vegetables are potatoes and carrots. Now, what you've done here is to reduce the job of remembering 9 items to the job of remembering 3. And clearly, the items must be logically grouped, or you can't summarize. And because they're logically grouped, in the sense that you're not going to put the apples in with the dairy products, if you forget one, referring to the category will remind you of what's missing. Now, the thing to note here is that each of these is a mini pyramid, hence the Minto pyramid principle. And all I'm saying is that if, in fact, people are going to store information like this in their minds in order to keep it straight, does it not make sense for you to give it to them that way? Would it not have been easier if the lady had said to her husband, "Darling, we need some dairy products and some fruits and some vegetables." And the dairy products are, and the fruits are, and the vegetables are. Yes, it might have taken a little extra time in advance to be able to say that, but at least she could have been certain that he comprehended the entirety of what it was she was saying and came back with what she wanted. And that's the key word here, the entirety. If you write something, whether it's 2 pages long or 20 pages long or 200 pages long, you expect that whoever reads it will comprehend the entirety of what it is you're saying. There is no way that's going to happen, given the constraints in people's minds, unless you pyramid the ideas. Now, you can take this concept that since people store information in this way, this is the way you ought to present it to them, and apply it to writing. In a situation where you're bringing together large numbers of ideas to present to somebody else, you will find that if the ideas belong together, they are always going to form this kind of structure. What you'll be doing is bringing together sentences into paragraphs, and paragraphs into sections, and sections under the overall point. And if you think for a minute about what happens when you sit down to write, in fact, what you do is bring together, say, 3 sentences into a paragraph. Now, suppose these boxes here represent sentences, and you bring together 3 of them into a paragraph. The reason you bring together those 3 sentences and no others is always that there's a relationship between them. And the relationship is always going to be that these are the only ones that are needed to explain or defend the point of the paragraph, which in effect is going to be a summary of them. In other words, you wouldn't bring together 2 sentences on finance and 1 on tennis, would you? Because what would be the point? How would they relate? All right, we bring together the sentences on finance, and then you say, I'm not going to fool around remembering these individual ideas when I can remember the one idea that ties them together. And now what you've done is move your thinking up a level of abstraction. And at this level, you think of the paragraph as containing only one idea. And you bring it together with, say, 2 others. And again, the reason you bring together those 3 paragraphs and no others is that those are the only ones needed to explain or defend the point of the section. And you have those 3 sections and no others because those are the only ones needed to explain or defend the point of the document. So that no matter what you're writing, if the ideas you bring together validly belong together, then you will find that you're always writing to explain or defend only one single idea. Does that not have a lovely simplicity? Now, sometimes people say to me, yes, yes, Barbara, but what if I have more than one idea? But you're never going to have more than one idea, are you? Because if you have 2 ideas and you wish to discuss them in the same document, you must be able to summarize them at a higher level. If you can't express them as a summary thought, what does that tell you? Either that the ideas don't go together, or that your thinking about them is incomplete. In other words, you have some bricks missing from your brick wall, and that's a great insight. Remember I said you build the pyramid from the bottom up, but you present it from the top down. Let's trace the structure of a clearly written document to demonstrate how the words move down the pyramid. This one is about Stonehenge. The Stonehenge sun-moon alignments were created and elaborated for 2, possibly 3 reasons. They made a calendar particularly useful to tell the time for planting crops. They helped to create and maintain priestly power by enabling the priests to call out the multitudes to see the spectacular risings and settings of the sun. And probably they served as an intellectual game. Then he goes on to support each point. As you can see then, the structure serves as an outline governing the flow. And once you grasp the structure, you grasp the message. Before we go on to look at why the presentation should always be top-down, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate this way of reading to yourself. So why don't we pause here while you look at the exercise in the workbook. You now agree, I hope, that a message that is not structured in a pyramid comes across less easily than one that does reflect a pyramid. You may also have noted that in the 3 examples, the pyramid message was always presented from the top down. In other words, once you have the structure and are ready to write, you always want to start at the top and write an introduction that leads to the main point, then make the main point, and then, if the document is longer than 7 paragraphs long, you introduce the ideas on the key line. Then, you pretend that there are fences in your thinking here, and you go back and you develop first all of this leg, and then all of this, and then all of this. In each case, making the top point before you make these. The reason you make the top point first is that there is another constraint in people's minds to which you have to respond, and that is what I call gestalt. And it refers to a set of theories of perception that were developed in the 20s. Now, what Gestalt says essentially is that people have an automatic tendency to impose order out of chaos. Remember how the Greeks used to look up at the stars and see pictures up there? There weren't any pictures up there. It's just that some of the stars were closer together than others. And what the Greeks said was, gee, I wonder how come those stars are so close together? And then they invented the answer. The reason they're so close together is that those are the only ones that are needed to make a picture of a dipper, or those are the only ones that are needed to make a picture of a lady sitting in a chair. Translated, what that means for us is that those things that appear together will always be presumed by the mind as belonging together. In other words, if I put 6 dots on the screen here, you're not going to see 6 dots. What you're going to see instead is 2 groups of 3. You can't help it. Now, if you apply this insight to the poor reader, he can take in only 1 sentence at a time, and he's going to presume that those sentences that appear together belong together. And if you don't tell him in advance how they are meant to go together, one of 3 things is going to happen. First, he won't see the relationship, or he'll see the wrong relationship, or it will take him longer to see the relationship. Now, the way you keep it from happening is that always you make this point before you make these, and this one before you make these. The point above establishes the framework within which to judge how the ideas grouped below are meant to go together. If you do it any other way, you really can be confusing to your reader or your listener. Now, sometimes people object to this rule because they don't want to state the point at the top first. In that case, what should you do? Well, let me give you an example. Let's say you have this client, all right, who's a billionaire. And let's say he's worked all his life to build up an immense empire that he runs in the center, like a tyrant. He's 90 years old. He's thinking about retiring. And he's called you in to evaluate the company and pat him on the back and tell him what a monument he's leaving to posterity. Well, you've come in and looked around, and you realize that the minute he dies, the place is going to fall apart. So you know that the point you want to make at the top of the pyramid is you should decentralize. You also know that if you walk in and say, "Good morning, sir, we think you should decentralize," he'll throw you out. So the question is, what do you say, given that you must say something to serve as the framework for what's going to be said below, and you can't use the word decentralize? What you'd have to do is say something like, "Good morning, sir. We think you should have the organizational structure that will permit you to respond most profitably to the environment in which you find yourself. And to that end, what we should like to do today is look at the changes taking place in your environment, assess your organization's ability to respond properly to those changes, and determine what shifts, if any, need to be made, on the theory that if he buys the first and he buys the second, he'll buy the third." Now, what I've just done here is to change the wording of the point to reflect the likely emotional response of the reader, but I have not changed the essence of the point. What we're looking at here is the distinction between style, that is the wording of the points, and structure, the relationship between the points. Think of a chair. The English language allows you to call it any number of things. I can call it a seat. I can call it Aunt Emily's heirloom. I can call it the cat's bed. I can call it the place we store the books under. I can call it the step we use to get to the top shelf. And in each case, I'm referring to exactly the same thing. By the same token, if I say you should decentralize, or if I say you should have the organization structure that will permit you to respond most profitably to the environment in which you find yourself, structurally, I'm not saying anything different. Stylistically, they're very different. And the reason you would use one set of words over the other is because of the emotional impact of the words. But to change the words is not to change the point. Let me summarize the essence of the Minto pyramid principles so far. A person can remember only a limited number of things at any one time, so you must group, and the groupings must be logically related, or you can't move up in an orderly way. That says you must organize your ideas in a pyramid structure. And when you feed them to the reader, you feed them from the top down, in each case making the point above before you present the ideas group below. Now, once you recognize that ideas in a clear piece of writing must always end up in this pyramidal form, then there are some rules that the ideas must obey if you're going to create that form. There are only 3 rules. First, ideas at any level in the pyramid must be summaries of the ideas group below them because they were derived from them. In other words, this idea summarizes these points, this idea summarizes these points, and so on. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? Because that's how you built the thing up. Rule number 2. In order to be able to summarize a grouping of ideas to the next level, the ideas in the grouping must be logically the same. Now let me show you why this has to be the case. You can combine oranges and apples and call them fruit. And you can combine chairs and tables and call them furniture. But now, suppose you want to combine apples and chairs. You can't do it at the next level because that's already taken. You'd have to move very much higher and call them something like things or inanimate objects. But that's a useless thing to say about them. If I say to you, I'm thinking